this is the short shrift.
No, we get a discount. See, when he leaves, we get a credit for the time.
So can you hear me as I'm asking this?
I can, yeah, I can hear you. And then I've got the audio on
Did you get those? I sent them.
I have an extra copy.
Well, I could look at them, yeah.
Yeah, here.
I could just make it up, too.
Certainly can. Nobody better.
So,
Nobody better make it up.
I got, our first question was, these have been drafted from Nick's perspective, which is, you did a great job on these. What stands out to you about the design of Emerson Buckhead? Talk about a few specifics and why you were drawn to the project.
Well, I think what is unique about the Emerson one is the location's a very good location. We can say it's got, great ability to go north to south, but it's really at the center. But it's also in a quieter area of Peachtree, which is mostly devoted to residential versus a lot of commercial. So I like that about it. And then I think the other thing is the building itself, the design of the building itself. It's one of the few sort of what I would call glass buildings where you have, the floor to ceiling type glass that actually works as far as creating this transition from inside space to outside space. And it's almost like the glass is just there as something to protect you from the changes in air and weather, but in reality it's not really there. And you've accomplished that by basically having very large expanses of these, and I wouldn't really call yours terraces, I'd call them sort of platforms, or in some ways I'd call them yards in the sky, because you've actually given people who are moving from a home that has a yard into something that's big enough, they feel like they have their own small yard or their own outside space at an elevated position. So that's really unusual for a high-rise building to do that. It's a building that I could vision myself living in and not be afraid of being outside. And I have a fear of heights, and I could actually be on one of your terraces and enjoy myself. There are numerous buildings I've been in over the years that I cannot have that experience.
The Harrison Design has a lot of expertise in creating seamless transition between indoor, outdoor living spaces. Why is that important, and how will you specifically apply that knowledge to the living spaces at Emerson?
Well, I think one of our signatures of design is that we're one of the few firms that can take a traditional project or typical residence or any of this and make it connect. We were one of the first firms in Atlanta that sort of set that mantra, and hence we became a brand based on it. What you've done is create a structure that does that. What our job is to continue that philosophy of how the inside and outside spaces integrate. So there has to be, when we're doing the interiors and taking the shell or the structure, you've given us a beautiful frame, okay? Our job is to detail that frame and make sure it respects that concept that I talked earlier about, this very gracious connection, and accentuate. And that's going to be how we use materials. So there's a consistency of materials. There are things that penetrate, say the ceiling as it goes out, penetrates, and you see the reflection of it continuing outside. So it's almost like the glass is not even there. So your eye's drawn through. And when you do that, you immediately flow. And we've done that on numerous projects where you really can't tell there's an interior and exterior space. And when you bring the outside as part of the interior, you're basically barring space. So now your unit feels more gracious, you feel more connected, and
Especially when you're...
right, and well, a nano wall opens it up, but that's just one element of the process. I think here you've got the nano walls, you've got all that, but you've also created enough outside to sort of guide you through and get you there. Because there is actually something that's worth going to on your project. I mean, some developers would say they're giving away free space, they don't want to spend the money on it. What you've done is given space that has value for the interior of the unit. So you've made the unit considerably larger and bigger than it seems within itself. Most buildings have a isolation between the interior of a building and the exterior. The two do not typically connect. It's usually a psychological process to get from here to outside. Most houses do that, whether they're sitting 1-story, 2-story, 3-story, or in your case, multi-story. And what you've done with this building is do that. And then also, you've made it interesting. You haven't stacked everything in a vertical fashion. So as your building moves up, you have units that move in and out. So you've created kind of a dynamic thing, so everything's not the same. And everybody has their own identity, and everybody's proud of their own unit. It's just like driving down the street. You can create a subdivision or a street, and if every house is exactly the same, it's kind of pointless. You know, it makes no sense. There's no interest. But if you have a really nice boulevard that is nicely lined with trees, and then you mix modern with contemporary and classical, and it all has good integrity of design, then the street becomes fascinating. And it's like a subdivision in Chicago, Riverside, it's Frank Lloyd Wright. And that particular subdivision, none of the houses look like each other. He could have cared less what the architecture was. What he tried to do is create a sense of place. So your building is creating a sense of place, which is different than kind of warehousing people into a vertical structure. So that's what I see very different about. And what you're doing is unique to Atlanta. I have not seen it done here, period.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of our buyers and a lot of our, what we call they're right on the fence buyers, it took them a minute for them to kind of understand the relation between the inside and the outside. The model was extremely helpful. When we had our opening party, we didn't have the model yet. And a lot of people, you know, unless you know, are an architect or have grown up, you know, the way I grew up, you don't, you know, you just don't, the concept is a little bit out there for you. And then to be able to show them something physically, it helps them kind of relate to that. And then also we've got this AV piece that we're bringing in that will allow people to literally put on goggles, or not put on goggles, and just see on the television their particular unit.
Correct.
And how they walk through it, how it feels to them. And it's, you know, that was the reason we built out the kitchen, you know, the kitchen and half the bathroom. We wanted to keep all of we wanted to edify people, which is something that was not normal for this city, or for the Southeast for that matter. I mean,
Well, you've also done something that's not typically normal in this type of building. I mean, you can go to New York, you're not necessarily going to see it. There are a lot of other cities you're not going to see this type of building. I mean, to be honest with you, in Singapore, you see some of this indoor-outdoor spaces. You have these huge areas that are really large, you know, living environments. And that's, you know, very experimental there, but people come from all over the world just simply to see it. You know, I think in your case, you've taken a lot of those concepts, which people typically are not used to seeing. And you've also taken concepts that people are naturally, biologically programmed to like. Okay? So what happens is, as much as we want to think of ourselves as disconnected from nature and civilized, and not having a connection to the, you know, the outside world, whether it's just watching the moon or the stars or the air or the connection or the wind or just any of that type of space, we're biologically programmed for that. We were biologically programmed for millions of years to know that space, experience. We watch our clients even drawn to the colors of nature versus other colors, and the proportions of nature, and the classical proportions and things are from nature. They're part of our body, they're part of our DNA, they're part of who we are. And what happens is when you miss that, you're uncomfortable. And that's why if you put a person in, I hate to use the word, say, a prison, and a lot of these high-rises, in my opinion, are that way. They're so sterile, and they're so disproportionate, and there's not any connectivity to anything. You go up an elevator, you get off, you got some cabinets, you put your stuff in, and then you go to bed. Okay, we've all stayed in hotels like that. Now, the idea is you just go in there to sleep. So you're being put into a little box and you sleep. But that's no way to live. So what you've done is the exact opposite. There is no box in your building. It's a series of layers that are interrupted by simple, easy, almost invisible transitions. And I think that's what's unique about your project.
Well, I also think that, the fact that it's 3 separate towers, there are no hallways. I mean, you do have a back common core, but you open out into your unit. You can have a vestibule. You don't have to have a vestibule, so to speak. I think that's also something that gives it an identity of itself, because the west is a different design than the south.
Right.
The north is different than the south.
Well, the way you did it, building where you pulled it apart and stretched it and made the wings, you created much more exterior surface, hence more glass, hence more connection to the outside, more platforms, more terraces. What we do a lot of time in residential on the ground is if we have a big enough lot, we just take the house, it could be like this big mass in the center, and we pull it, stretch it, and we stretch it and we pull it in angles, and we make the site, make it flow with the site so it becomes part of the topography. And I think what you've done is the same thing.
There's a house that you just finished on Northside Drive, and is it Davis? On the way to my dad's house, it's on the corner. And initially I was watching it as it was being built, and it's a big house.
Yeah.
And the lot doesn't seem that large, but yet now I drive by it and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense to me. It fits.
Yeah.
It's got some really interesting moves in that building.
Right.
Which
Thank you.
normally when you're watching something, at a hard lesson in that when my father was building the beach house, I moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles to open our office there. And the first morning that I was getting ready to go to the office, I had already set up the LA Times and the New York Times to be delivered. I pick up the LA Times and there's a picture of the house. And it says, "Architect's Dream, Neighbor's Nightmare." And they got all their, their kind of gossipy, bad, information from my father's best friend's widow.
Yeah.
He had sold the front part of that little house that's in front of his house. And what that taught me was you should never judge anything until it's finished.
Correct.
You should really let people finish their vision before you actually weigh in on whether or not you think this is an appropriate design, or whether it's the right scale, or whether, because people tend to jump the gun a lot.
Well, that should be applicable to news today. The developing story is not the story.
Thank you.
I mean, it's a total waste of energy being involved in something that's not fully developed, because you can't. It's like saying I'm not going to like what you're cooking as it's being chopped up and prepped. You have
Smells great. Well, wait a minute. Why? It smells good.
no. I mean, yeah, patience is something we lack a lot of today, and tolerance.
Especially, everybody wants it yesterday, and the problem is there are a lot of people that have the ability to sit in a little corner, and just type away and just destroy you, and you know, they really don't have any, you know, they haven't put their hat in the ring. They're not playing the
No.
game. They're just, you know.
Well, if they put their hat in the ring, they would actually be in the ring doing something.
Exactly.
And it,
Keyboard warriors.
yeah, but you sit over here on the sideline and make comments, you're really not accomplishing anything.
No, but,
Yeah.
you know, you're putting, you know, negativity out there, which is unfortunate. There are some key differences when designing a brand new luxury condo versus renovating space. I would say let's use the Wakefield as an example.
Correct.
As opposed to, you know, this building. You know, from your experience, what do buyers need to know about their design options when comparing the two choices? And how does that connect the overall level of control they have in the design process?
Well, I think the Wakefield, when you really look at it, and I think of some of the high-rises, that's one of the better ones. It's done really well. It has a lot of architectural integrity. It is, in fact, a more traditional building with a very traditional footplate. And
They feel like home.
yeah, they feel like homes. So they're really traditional homes sort of stacked up. The thing about a traditional home in that case is you have less flexibility with spatial flow.
Right.
In other words, you're dealing with definitions of space. Classical architecture and traditional architecture is based upon space having its own integrity, and then you move from that space to the next space to the next space, and that's really kind of the flow. Now you do have the actual relationships, and sometimes you occasionally share space, but it's very clear that you're in this space and you're in this space. What you're doing is very different. Your space is more fluid. In other words, you could take your building and you could put a very traditional floor plan within it. I mean, you could go from space to space to space. It could be like a warehouse where you have space boxes, sort of. Robert did an incredible building, and we did the penthouse up in Concourse, and where you went in there and we created these spaces within the space. And so it's a very fluid exterior, but then there's this sort of little bento box he created, which is really, it's some neat interior. They're very internal to themselves, but there are elements within it. You have the opportunity to either let people flow very open, or you also have the opportunity to give them their little cocoons within the space. And that's not typical with a lot of, that was a very big floor plate we had to work with and large space. It doesn't have the height, ceiling heights that you have. And that was a restriction that was challenging. But what...
The one that was about 5 feet off the ground?
Yeah.
The part, the
Yeah.
point?
Yeah. So, you know, we floated spaces within space, and it was an absolutely brilliant play on space. It made everything seem bigger because you were compressed and then you were released. But I do think that your building has a lot of opportunities. In some ways, it's like a modern warehouse that you're going to be able to work within.
Well, it's also, I think that, you know, we found in that a lot of our buyers are combining units. And so we only have 41. And at the end of the day, I think we'll end up with somewhere between 32 to 34 owners. And, you know, and I think for us, you know, we didn't have that option until we kept hearing, you know, a lot of in the early days, we kept hearing, we don't want to have our transition to be vertical. And so from the 14th floor, which is the top of the west, you can literally have 14 west, 14 south, 14 north, all the way down the building. So you can get 8,900 square feet all on one level.
Yeah.
And we actually have one person that's looking at doing that. And for us, a lot of it has to do with listening instead of just, you know, imposing our way of thinking. Because, you know, for example, I'm actually gonna move into this building, and I'm combining 2 units. If you'd have told me I was gonna do that 5 years ago, I would have said, you're crazy, I just finished this house, and
Yeah.
it's in a great, it's right off Whitewater Creek, it's
Yeah.
quiet. But, my wife and I, we have a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I have 2 older children from earlier marriage. We want to have that ability to lock and leave.
Yeah.
And, because, we spend a lot of time in Los Angeles, and she's an actress, I think she's ready to go back to work. And I spent probably 27 years in California, so I really enjoyed it out there.
Well, it's all about the weather. 5 degrees one way or the other.
Except this last month.
Yeah, her parents have a place in Highlands, and it's just amazing to me, once you start going up that hill, you literally lose 15 degrees.
Absolutely.
It's just fabulous. So it's, I think with any building that you're trying to, because our other projects have been apartment projects, we're trying to give those apartment buyers as many elements and options that they, that we can give them. And we talk about buildings and the concept of, we feel like you have 5 moments that you really need to hit the hammer and the nail on the head. And, it's your bathroom, it's your kitchen, it's the lobby, it's how you enter the building.
What's your first impression?
Yeah, and because you've only got one shot at that first impression. It's your community space, your communal space, whether it be on the roof, which it is on Lily, and here, which is, on top of the garage, and then you have that 20-foot waterfall, which is one of those things that intuitively, we just, as humans, respond to falling water.
Sure.
And, and this design was somewhat, inspired by falling water. But, with apartments, it's different. Here, you're building homes for people. So it's hard in the sense that we can't get into the realm of building custom homes. Now we can sell you a shell, and you can have, your designer and your builder build your shell.
Your builders.
Yes. And what we're doing with Brassfield and Gorey is, the people that we do sell the shells to, you would be included on this list, but there are going to be 3 or 4 people that we will have Brassfield and Gorey allow them to work alongside them, so that when we CO the building, people are moving into their units.
Right.
They're not going to have to listen to somebody for 2 years build out their space, because that really, to us, defeats the purpose of spending this kind of money, and we want to make sure that happens.
And that's all about the team effort and coordination.
And Brassfield's great.
They do an incredible job.
They really do.
Yeah.
And we've had a great experience with them at Lilly, Midtown, and frankly, I wouldn't, I've worked with other contractors here, and they're just, we've spent a lot of time researching them as far as, the CSIP insurance, all of the things that go into protecting ourselves, as well as the level of commitment, the level of.
Well, they're one of their big assets is quality and schedule.
Exactly.
Those are the 2 things they do best. I know you didn't pick the cheapest contractor, because they're not that.
No, they're not that.
Yeah, but they are good on schedule. They're good on quality.
And you get what you pay for.
Absolutely.
And, I'm always, I'm sure a lot of people would pick the cheapest. But, to me, you always end up having to go back and redo a lot of things that, you wouldn't have to do if you just understood, maybe I'd take the hit now, and not have to deal with it. You know, if you're planning on holding it, if you're planning on selling it, then
Yeah.
you have a different attitude.
Well, we tell that to the clients. It's a whole lot less expensive to do it right the first time
Exactly.
than to go into it. And I think for a lot of people, I think when you think about houses and homes and being in your building in the space, this is not something they do every day. They may do 1 or 2 houses their whole life, maybe 3 or 4. Or if they move, we have some clients that do up to 10, but that's a lot. So they're not familiar with what can go wrong. So a professional team that consists of the architect and the interior group, and we have both internally, and so the idea is to prevent them from making these errors themselves. So our job, and along with the team's job, particularly the contractor and everyone, to sit down and say, this is what's going to happen. These are the consequences of your decisions, and advise them. The consequences can be, well, if you do this, this is what's going to happen later. Or have you thought about, you want to live like this now, but what are you going to be like in 10 years? And so you may like a particular bathroom now, but 10 years from now, it needs to be more accessible than you might think. And then on the other hand, so they're not changing things, they're not missing things. So I think a lot of times the architect and help designing a house or a building or a space has a responsibility as a professional to coach the client through this process and be transparent, tell them the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then at the end of the day, everybody comes out much better as a winner. I think a lot of firms don't do that. They just think, well, this is a great design, we got this great idea, you're going to be our guinea pig, so we're going to experiment with you. And you're our patron, you're not our client. So when you take that attitude, you're really missing the point, because the person's here to get what they want and what they need. So our job function is to advise them and get them there. If what they want or need isn't going to work, we have to tell them. But we have to tell them respectfully so that they understand, well, it's not going to work. And that's what you're doing with your graphics, you're basically using a gaming platform to show these things, and that's very helpful. The model's helpful. But you're also got to remember, you're bringing something people know intuitively they're going to love. But until they see it, they don't know it. So it's kind of like history. We can all look back at history, and we are really smart, because we can tell everything that went wrong in history and why they did it wrong and what the problem is. But you're also trying to tell people, we're trying to take where you were 1,000,000 years ago, living with a cave, which you walked outside and you didn't have any windows. You were completely connected outside for good or bad. You might get eaten or you might not get eaten, but you still had that connectivity. So now you're trying to put that into a vertical space and do what modern technology allows us to do and live in that fashion. And so it's very different, but you're actually your building is very organic, like a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, and you're very kind of primitive in your connectivity and how a lot of that works, which I think is a good thing, because it's very naturalistic for a high-rise building. Minimalistic and naturalistic. It's not distracting. It's a little bit like when you're traveling in Asia or in places where you see the most simple forms sometimes have the most power. And yeah. So I think those are things that you've got here, but the team has to be able to execute that, because minimalist details are more difficult for a contractor to execute than something that has a lot of stuff going on. Yeah, because if you got a lot of stuff going on, nothing has to fit, because no one knows the difference. They're looking at clutter, not substance. It's two entirely different things. Yeah.
So, when you follow, when we, follow, I'm trying to think if I let's go to, you've taken on numerous high-end luxury projects in Atlanta, specifically in Buckhead. What role do you see Emerson playing within the bigger picture view of the overall area? Do you see the project breaking new ground, helping to set new trends for a high-end design in Atlanta? Do you see this building as hopefully getting the city to, and its other developers to say, okay, all right, they've proven you can do it. Let's not continue to keep building the same project over and over.
Well, I think what this will do for Atlanta is a lot of buildings we see are driven to the lowest common denominator. I think what you did, which is intelligent, you start out with units that could be 3,000 square feet, but the way your building's designed, with the way you pull it apart, you can have an L-shaped unit, but you didn't design it with a 6,000 square foot block that you had to have. Because when you do that in a building, you have a lot of hallways and stuff. What you've done is take a whole series of sort of options that can be connected in different ways. So you've kept the integrity of the smaller units, but you initially marketed the smaller units because of price point. And you didn't reduce the quality to get to the price point of design and the functionality of the building. Whereas most of the people we've watched, they will drive that design to the lowest common denominator. And the thing about it is, when people have only seen mediocre, they think mediocre is good.
Right.
You know, Beth said, we did a house for Roberto Gosueta, the chairman of Coke, and I asked him one day, I said, why do people really do dumb things? He said, well, Bill, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man's king. So Atlanta, when it comes to design, particularly in this building type, the vertical building type versus horizontal, I would say Atlanta has a long tradition in classical traditional design, probably some of the best in the country. But when you get to more urban and the vertical structure, it's a very new concept in this area. So we're very much in the early stages of that. What this building will do is actually show people, it will sort of give it two eyes versus one. So the vision is going to change. And when people can see and actually experience that, people will come see this building, they'll come over, they'll have their friends over, people will stay there, they'll visit it, then they'll want one.
Right.
And so I think what you're doing is opening up the opportunity for a higher level of finish. When we first started houses and residences, I mean, if someone wanted to spend $500,000 or $1 million, I would tell you, you could have anything you want. Now what we're just seeing is people are willing to pay something as simple as brick.
Yeah.
If you take a brick and you put out, the builder says, oh, you don't want to spend more than $300 1,000 on brick because it's too much money. But you take a $300 1,000 brick and put it out on the table for the client to look at, and you put a 800 or 1,000 cost brick next to it, every time they choose the other one because they see the difference. The only way we've ever gotten clients to pick a decent window that will last the test of time is have a physical sample there, have them open the window and close it. They will pay twice as much for a window. And because they're getting twice the product, they can feel it, they can see it. It's the same thing with touching a doorknob or a plumbing fixture. You cannot get them to buy a decent piece of door hardware until they put it in their hands and they get that feel and they get connection. And then at that point, the cost is really not the important factor. And the same thing with your building. Once they're actually in the space and people can start to see the building evolve. And I think your presentation and how you're doing it with the, really the 3D and the virtual reality is going to help people get there, because you're asking them to understand something they've never seen, okay, and how it's really going to flow and work. And I think once they get a sense of that, and in fact the people that have bought in have just said, I get it. So what you're doing is you're taking I get it, and you're going to give them I got it, and And then when you go to I got it, I think people will actually take the next step. What happens is when we first started doing housing in Buckhead, one of the biggest compliments I ever had from several people was you actually raised the quality of what's being built because you built here and everybody had to come in and compete with you. And when you do that, it's kind of like, a high tide floats all boats. So to me, this building is sort of a watermark or a high tide in vertical construction, which I think is going to change the way the city of Atlanta looks at it. Because I could take you through, 100 other high-rises in here. None of them are going to feel like this space. They're just not going to do it. That's what I think. What do you think? Yeah.
So, we,
But I also think you're bold and inventive to do this, and you may not make as much as you think, but you will change the direction of a process. And sometimes that's more important than how much money you make.
our ideology is that great architecture is great business.
Yeah.
And, with regards to Edmund Porter, which was our first project, if you had told me I was going to leave our big family company and start this company and I was going to be building apartments instead of working in China or India, I would have said, you're out of your mind. And in that process, Bruce,
But we're actually glad you did.
well, it's that was a different product for multifamily with 40,000 square feet of retail, and then
Yeah, but it was well done,
well, it was right for what.
that area.
That area.
It was a perfect site for that.
And we went through about 600 images, and it's interesting because the architect with Smith Dahlia now works with us.
Yeah.
And we had basically we had 6 Saturdays of charrettes with the neighborhood.